Gregory Adams, thanks so much for coming on to Evolutionsoup all the way from Phoenix, Arizona. You are a recent graduate from Northern Arizona University with a bachelor's in biology, having gone back to school at age 39 to pursue a new career path. Your hypothesis that hominids evolved to walk upright on more than one occasion in prehistory was the subject of your final thesis, and that fascinating hypothesis is what we'll be diving into today. Welcome to the show, Greg. Going back to school in your late 30s no doubt had its challenges. Now, having graduated, would you recommend it?
Absolutely. I mean, we never stopped learning. It was pretty fun and simple at first with junior college and going part-time. School was kind of relaxing, not very overwhelming. It was when I entered my undergraduate that I became a full-time student, and juggling life, kids, and school was an incredible challenge.
Well, before we explore your hypothesis, let's just hear a little bit about your background. Greg, did you always have an interest in science and in particular, the story of human lineage?
I was born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona. I didn't necessarily have an interest in sciences or paleoanthropology at an earlier age. Biology class did interest me in high school, but my main interests were more sports and the fine arts. My influences, my father started teaching me at a very young age how to draw. I had some great teachers in high school, taught me how to think about art, things like that. And my main influence just visually was Salvador Dali. I just always found his work to be just on another level creatively. Paleoanthropology came around about into my freshman year. I think I had posted something on social media about the discovery of Homo luzonensis, and a cousin of mine who was an anthropology graduate, she commented down there, I have something for you. And about a week later, a book showed up in the mail, Almost Human by Lee Berger. I read it, I cracked it open, and I read it over the summer, and I was just hooked. Then I discovered Audible, and I started listening to audiobooks about paleoanthropology on my spare time. And then it really just became sort of a quest to try and solve the mystery, or some of the mysteries.
Well, the hypothesis you came up with for your final paper was an idea you'd already had in your mind for some time. So what exactly was expected of you with this final paper, and what is your hypothesis in a nutshell?
So the class I took was Advanced Evolutionary Theory at Northern Arizona University. And for the capstone paper, which was kind of like the final paper, or some might call it a thesis, the assignment guidelines were to write an article review. So each student would select a topic and research that topic. And they wanted 20 peer-reviewed articles from peer-reviewed journals referenced. But the guidelines were to research the subject, and in the discussion or towards the conclusion, they wanted you to come up with a new hypothesis, taking all that information that you researched and sort of putting it all together and coming up with a new theory or a new hypothesis or just something new. I used the book Ancient Bones by Madeline Bohm as sort of a framework. I had read that book and was just really moved by the book. The book covered recent finds, recent hominid discoveries outside of Africa. Most people think of hominid evolution, they think of it taking place in the country of Africa, but there's actually an entire old world full of archaeological sites. And she goes over some of the late Miocene discoveries in Europe and Eurasia, and it just really opened my eyes to a different perspective about hominid discovery. She mentions if these speciation events were happening in Mesopotamia during the late Miocene, and you had this explosion of, different species of apes with hominin-like affinities, then, wouldn't this be the true cradle of humankind? Referring to Lee Berger's cradle of humankind that he mentions in Almost Human, that he details to be located in South Africa. So I guess when I think about the cradle of humankind, whether it's South Africa or Eurasia, I think it's really relative to what time period you're talking about, because the Eurasian cradle of humankind would predate the South African cradle of humankind, and realistically, there's probably mass speciation events in different biodiversity hotspots all over the old world. So to try and put my hypothesis into a nutshell, because it's rather involved, I would say that bipedalism is convergent, that it can be subject to convergent evolution, just like we see in other birds and mammals. This most likely occurred more than once convergently over the last 7 to 8 million years since our split with Pan, maybe even further back. This can also happen, this coming down from the trees to walk upright, can also happen in reverse. If a species of apes, of bipedal or ground-dwelling apes, found that it was most parsimonious or necessary to retreat back into the trees, and that's where they begin to spend the majority of their time, then those animals would be subject to the same laws of evolution that all other animals are, and eventually they would begin to adapt to the tree-dwelling life and take on tree-dwelling features, maybe such as the shape of the femur, the shape of the feet, the phalanges, or the opposable tree-grabbing big toe, like you see in orangutans, things like that. Naturally, this would just occur no matter how the environment changed. Apes are highly adaptable, so they would adapt to any given situation generally. This would also explain the strange mosaic of features that we see in these hominids. We have one bipedal ape over here with human feet. We have another one over here with extremely primitive teeth, but human-like hands. We have another one over here that's real small, tree dweller, but the teeth look extremely human. This coming down and going back into the trees, like as these species deal with these many great revolutions and the many great changes that's happened over 8 million years. I mean, I think people really don't realize how long 8 million years is. It's changing, this going back and forth and back and forth into the trees, out of the trees. There's really two major ecological niches when you look at things from more of a broad scope. Ape species are generally arboreal, or they're ground dwellers, terrestrial. And I think that this theory slash hypothesis begins to describe this strange mosaic of features that paleoanthropologists have been stumped and confused by for decades now. I do believe that this hypothesis is a new idea. I think it's definitely a new hypothesis. I mean, when we think of our human lineage, traditionally we think it only occurred once. I have seen some chatter in the articles, in the peer-reviewed journals about bipedalism, about convergent evolution in bipedalism, but mainly referring to early hominids or early apes with hominin-like affinities that might have stood up and walked across branches or stood up to reach fruits. And this would have been more of a temporary bipedalism, just moving from one end of a branch to the other or grabbing a fruit. But really, my hypothesis really delves into like 100% obligate bipedalism, more than one group of species coming out of the trees to stand up and walk upright on the ground. I mean, if it happened once, why wouldn't it happen twice? I mean, we're talking about 8 million years. And as apes, we are subject to the same laws of evolution that all other animals, all other mammals and birds are. So under the laws of evolution, it definitely could have happened more than once, and it most likely has.
Okay, let's break this hypothesis down into pieces because there's a lot to digest. The human story takes place over at least 8 million years and, as we'll see, branches off into many various and unexpected directions. But it's important to set the scene for the human story, and that means understanding how the landscape has changed over the years. Correct?
Correct. So the Messinian salinity crisis is a geological event that occurred about less than 6 million years ago. I think it's 5.3 to 5.9 million years ago. This is what, paleoclimatologists have discovered. And what the Messinian salinity crisis explains is that during this period, the Mediterranean Sea had completely dried up. This would have created a land bridge that would have allowed animals to cross over at will. The boundaries of Africa, we think that using today's coastlines, that how did they get across into Europe or Asia? They must have found these, skinny little areas that they could have crossed or they could have swam, but really it was a wide open range. It wasn't necessarily Africa separated from Eurasia. It was one massive continent where Europe, Asia, and Africa were all combined, and animals could freely move across, what is modern day Northern Africa and the Middle East. I believe there is a land shelf that's underwater off the coast of Ethiopia that sort of goes across the coastlines of Yemen, Oman, and Iran and Pakistan, on the northern end. And that with water levels this low, this land shelf would have been exposed. So there was another area where, all kinds of speciation events or migration events could have occurred. But so other megafauna, ancient megafauna from North Africa has documented ancestry in Southern Europe. So why not hominids? When we think about these boundaries, when we think about these migrations, we use current coastlines. And what paleoclimatology is teaching us is that the coastlines were far, far different.
When we think of our ancestors gradually evolving to go from 4 legs to 2, we think of ancient hominids coming down from the trees with the goal of walking across the savannah. Most of us are happy to accept that this happened only once and stayed with us to this day. But convergent bipedality tells a different story. Isn't that right?
The savannah hypothesis, which is taught in colleges currently, is that a group of apes that were arboreal faced adversity with a loss of habitat or a change in environment with diminishing rainforests or what have you, and they were forced out of the trees. The distances between the patches of trees became greater as the patches became, fewer and farther in between. So they had to adapt walking upright to cross over the savannah, and this allowed the hands to be free for them to pick up, root tubers or whatnot of fruits and carry them in their hands back to home base, I guess. So for me, it's really about parsimony and thermal regulation. When it comes to any type of speciation event, animals are going to gravitate towards the most parsimonious avenue from point A to point B, with whatever adjustments they need to make, whichever pathway is most energy efficient. is going to be the most important for survival. So with bipeds, it's most parsimonious to walk upright on two legs for thermoregulation purposes, without getting into all that. But without the sun beating down on the entirety of the dorsal or backside of a four-legged creature, it's more or less just on the top, so that helps to regulate temperatures. And then with quadrupeds, or with tree-dwelling apes, it's going to be most parsimonious to have four legs that climb instead of two. It's going to just be much easier to climb through the trees and remain in the trees when you have sort of four tree-grasping extremities. The title of the article is A Phylogenetic Review of the Genus Homo, a Mechanism for Locomotion in Hominids. In the review, I consider the best candidates for the ancestors of the human lineage that are outside of Africa. There's just so much material that I had to sort of break it down into geographic sections. So because there's so much material out there on Africa, I decided, obviously influenced too by Madeleine Baume's book and some other materials, that that outside of Africa would be the place that I concentrated. Also, the guidelines of the assignment had a limit on how long it could be. It was like 6 type pages or 12 double-spaced pages. So I had to keep it, within a reasonable length. But what I wanted to do was just take an overview of all of these hominid creatures and scan for any anomalies in the fossil record that would, be curious in a way that would sort of make me look deeper maybe into a certain area or a certain set of bones. The very first anomaly that popped out at me, and this was sort of even before I wrote the paper, was the hobbits of Southeast Asia. The description of Luzonensis being arboreal just set off red flags for me, and I thought, this is extremely interesting, and I want to really focus some of the research in that area. The paper also covers sort of a prequel to African hominid evolution, pushing the dates for apes with hominid-like affinities back much, much further, even going back to sort of the mid-Miocene with Danuvius Guggenmosi, who was 11.62 million years ago. We talk about El Greco, Grecopithecus freybergi from Greece. We discussed the Dominici hominins, just absolutely mind-boggling evidence coming out of the Caucasus Mountains in the Republic of Georgia. About 20 years ago is when those bones were being uncovered. Dmanisi cave hominins were extremely fascinating because we had 3 different species of ancient humans living in the same cave over a long period of time. It sort of shows you a timeline, and you can also piece together these bones and almost see the evolution occurring right in front of your eyes. Just really fascinating. One skull was far more primitive than the others. That one was given the title Homo georgicus, and they have named it a new species. But from Homo georgicus, it seems to evolve into Homo ergaster, which we know ergaster is a precursor to Homo erectus. Homo erectus can definitely be attributed to being one of the probably biggest candidates for ancestor to the human lineage. And the Homo erectus fossils found in the Dmanisi cave were a very early model of erectus, almost 2 million years old they're dated to, but they're very short in stature. I think just barely touching 5 feet is the estimate. So, another thing that we can do is take another cave that is much more modern. The Denisovan cave in Siberia had 3 species of ancient archaic humans living in there as well. And DNA analysis has tied them all together as being relatives, whether they shared the cave at the same time or at different times. It seems to be over a long period of time. So that DNA evidence, I think, is really helpful when we're examining the Dmanisi hominins, because the DNA is not available because of the age, because the Dmanisi cave fossils are dated to 1.75 to 1.85 million years ago. And with technology today, the DNA is, unobtainable at this point, unfortunately. Overall, the nomenclature is kind of weird with the Dmanisi hominins. I think there's so many different interpretations in so many different directions that they finally titled it, Homo erectus ergaster georgicus, and they just lumped it all into one group, and that nomenclature is still being debated. Here is a 3D replica of Homo georgicus. You can see the resemblance, but it's very human-like. I believe he was about 4 feet tall and rather gracile. One thing that my paper concentrates on is these specimens seem to share a slenderness as opposed to the robustness of some of the African australopithecines and the robustus groups. Decades ago, when we started laying out these lineages, in the cladograms, the family trees of the human species, we had a linear model where they would grow and evolve as it went along the page. The more, I think it was probably maybe before Dr. Donald Johanson discovered Lucy, but when he did discover Lucy in Ethiopia, they believed they had found the missing link, and then this had changed the way we viewed the human family tree, and they said, well, it looks more, it's more like a tree. It's more like a tree branching out than it is this linear motion. And then since then, there's been many more missing links found. I mean, we seem to be finding these missing links all the time. And now it's become, well, it's not a tree. Maybe it's more of a bush with just, different clads sprouting out in all these different areas, and much less of a controlled way. In my college evolution courses, what they have been teaching lately is that they are now calling it a braided stream, where you have these interminglings of these different human species, like Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and whatnot, and they're all living together and coexisting. But I think that the more we learn about the DNA of our ancestors, the more we understand that interbreeding across species occurred. And I think that when you take interbreeding into account, that what we have is not so much a braided stream, but more of a matted dreadlock. And then now, if you look and add convergent evolution into the mix, I don't even know how you would quantify that. Like, I don't even know how you would draw that on paper or on a diagram. I definitely don't want to be the one to try and figure it out. For my overview from this research project, I think I was able to take sort of a broad scoped review. And what I sort of noticed is that apes generally, or primates in general, really only encompass 2 major ecological niches. We have the tree dwelling niche and we have the ground dwelling niche. And it's pretty much one of the two. I mean, we're not good swimmers. I'm not really a big supporter of the aquatic ape theory, as interesting as it is, and we don't fly. So we're really stuck to the ground and the trees. Hominids do come down from the trees to stand up. I mean, we have evidence of that with the Dmanisi hominins. You know, the earlier ones, the Homo georgicus model, the postcrania associated with that shows that it had a straight femur. It had a bow-shaped femur, that it had arboreal characteristics. And then if you follow the evolutionary scale across the ergaster specimens and on into, well, let's just say with the ergaster specimens, that they're deemed to be habilis-like, is the way it was put in some of the papers I read. And the more derived model would be, would be the Homo erectus, which was a fully upright ground dweller. So we sort of see this transition in these hominins that shared this cave and evolved while living in this cave. We are no exception to the rules, to the laws of evolution. We're subject to the same environmental pressures, or at least our ancestors before modern technology were subjected to the same laws of evolution as all other birds and mammals, all other animals in general, all other life in general. So whatever the adversity was, whatever the challenges were, we obviously adapted and overcame them. Darwin talks about mass land dispersal and descent of man. And I think what we also don't realize when we look back at the fossil record is how capable these hominids were of migrating just in all sorts of directions. And we have such a small piece of the record uncovered. But especially with erectus, I mean, he's been found all over the old world. So we want to say that a certain species that was found, say, in South Africa, really only lived in South Africa because that's the only piece of evidence we have. But that's not the case. And it's in the same with dating. We'd like to say that this particular species lived from 2 million years ago up until 1 million years ago, but we're only saying that based on the fossils that we've uncovered, and we're only assuming that that's the only dates that we can say for sure that we know. But there's a great possibility that they existed earlier or even later than what we have on the record. Madeline Baume talks about this in her book, and I think that your guest, Dr. Jeremy De Silva, also mentioned Madeline's book when he was talking about how these revolutions and climate change move across the earth. Forests come and go. They've come and go so many times over the last 8 million years. It's probably countless times. Ethiopia and Egypt and that area that's such a dry, arid desert now, supposedly was a lush green forest 10 to 15,000 years ago. 10 to 15,000 years ago in geologic time is really like last week. So I think these changing climates and these changing landscapes were changing faster than these ancient ape/hominin species were, and that they were constantly just trying to keep up with the changing events going on around them. And I think this constant striving for change, especially in ecosystems where they were thriving, created speciation events like the ones discussed in Dr. Lee Berger's book, like the ones discussed in Mesopotamia. Southeast Asia looks like we know it's a biodiversity hotspot for a lot of other animals. I believe it was also a biodiversity hotspot for ancient humans. I believe you could probably definitely add Southeast Asia to that list. And China has a lot of discoveries coming out of there that it looks like, there could even be another cradle of humankind in Asia. So, how many cradle of humankinds have there been? I mean, I think there's definitely been more than one, and I think there's definitely been more than a few.
So, is there any evidence for this hypothesis?
First of all, documented evidence by other scientists. The African megafauna with ancestry in Southern Europe, it's across the Mediterranean Sea. They have ancestors in Southern Europe. Why wouldn't African hominids have ancestors in Southern Europe? That's one piece of evidence. So another piece of evidence would be, they teach us this in college, that birds evolved flight. I believe this is actually biology 181, which is like your intro to biology. They teach you that birds evolved flight at what we know of 4 different places around the globe. And this was spread out, very far distances from each other globally. And this is actually the example they give you when they're teaching you about the subject of convergent evolution. In my research, I also found that Homo sapiens has convergently, I guess through DNA testing, convergently evolved the ability to digest lactose. What they call it is lactose tolerance into adulthood 3 different times at 3 different locales. Now, the evidence that I uncovered in my research, the Southeast Asian hobbits, this is a huge anomaly in the fossil record. We're talking about Homo luzonensis from Luzon Island in the Philippines. And then we're talking about Homo floresiensis from Flores Island in Indonesia. These 2 locations are about 700 miles apart. And on a grand scale, really, they're next door neighbors. These 2 species were extremely similar in so many ways, and they're both only 3 foot tall. However, one's a tree dweller. Homo luzonensis is a arboreal hominid, and Homo floresiensis is an upright walking biped. So we've almost caught these 2 creatures in the act of speciation, which is really fascinating to me. The true evidence lies in the femurs and the feet, the bones of the feet. We have with arboreal hominids or in ape species, we have like a straight sort of bow-shaped, like a bow and arrow shaped femur. And in ground-dwelling bipeds, as the evolution of the animal as it is standing up, that bow shape sort of gets extended, and in that extension it sort of twists into what they call an S-shaped curve. It's very distinct when you know what you're looking at. It's very distinct between the 2 femurs. So I think that evidence is really strong. You also have curved phalanges for grasping branches with Homo luzonensis. And these phalanges in Homo floresiensis were still slightly curved, but not nearly as drastic as they are in the tree-dwelling version. Another piece of evidence that I found interesting when I started using this 2 ecological niche sort of method of trying to generally classify some of these species into 2 groups was Australopithecus ramidus and Lucy. They're about 1 million years apart on our time scale, but they could have existed together. We don't have the evidence of that just yet, but they were living in the same area. And Ramidus has those tree grasping feet. He's a true freak of nature with those feet. And Lucy had feet like modern humans. So that's another anomaly. And that anomaly actually has even more supporting evidence. Recently, off the coast of, I think, Italy and the island of Crete, more fossilized footprints have been uncovered. And these footprints are definite bipeds. I mean, it looks as human as anything you've seen. And these date to about 7.1 million years ago. And, that is our split with Pan. So that creates a real wrench in the spokes. Lucy was considered a direct descendant of Ardipithecus. And I don't think that's the case. And I think there's a lot, I'm not the first to pitch that idea. There's a lot of people out there that have questioned that. But now the Crete footprints really solidify that. Tim White believes that the Crete footprints were made by Lucy, by Australopithecus afarensis. But the Crete footprints are 3 million years older than the fossil record for Lucy. So really, if that's the case, what we have is the ancestor of Lucy maybe made those footprints. And that seems really plausible, right? Because Lucy has the adducted hallux, has the human-looking foot. So we're in the same region. Granted, the Mediterranean is all dry and the pathways are clear. So my question is this: with Gregopithecus being found not far from Crete, it was found in one of them was Bulgaria, but the main mandible found was in Greece. We only have the mandible. We have one tooth from Bulgaria, and we have the mandible and part of a jawbone, but we don't have the postcrania. So the question is, did El Greco have an adducted hallux? Was it an upright walker? Something left those footprints in Crete. I do believe that the testing is fairly accurate enough to really throw that wrench into previous theories. And it's something I think we need to look more into. What creature left those footprints? It's a real mystery. Convergent evolution could be to blame for all these strange anomalies. With the Southeast Asian hobbits, we have this speciation event occurring in a known biodiversity hotspot really far away from, thousands and thousands of miles away from South Africa and Eurasia. And just the location alone, when you're talking about birds evolving flight, it's the distances between the speciation events that supports the theory of convergent evolution. And we have the same supporting evidence here. We do. And I believe convergent evolution is definitely a factor. It almost has to be, because convergent evolution is a product of the basic laws of evolution. And we can't escape those laws. We haven't ever been able to escape those basic laws, and I don't think we ever will, modern technology or not.
Well, it certainly is a thought-provoking proposition that you presented here today, and no doubt will go on to generate a lot of discussion. And I just want to thank you for coming on to Evolution Soup.
Thanks for having me. It's been my pleasure. Hopefully I can come back and discuss the second volume, where I sort of get back to basics and go back and investigate some of these anomalies in Africa.